Hello, and thank you for joining me. Today we're going to discuss a blog post by Jim Morgan, a member of a nonprofit organization called Meet the Need, which appears to be aimed at helping other charities with their networking needs. The blog of the organization, of which Jim seems to be the primary if not the sole writer, is philosophical in nature, and the post we're looking at today, from April 29th of this year, is entitled, "There's No Such Thing as an Atheist." Really? One is tempted to say, imagine being a plumber and being told that there's no such thing as a plumber. But we can't imagine that, can we? Because it never happens, because it's neither rational nor polite to plumbers to say there's no such thing as a plumber. This is not only universally accepted, but so obvious that you've probably never even thought about it before. Yet in many Christian communities, atheists are not extended the same courtesy as plumbers. The claim that atheists do not exist is a bold one, as it would entail that every single professed atheist in the world is lying. Not just mistaken, but outright lying. Morgan seems to be aware that such a claim is prima facie absurd, which is why he tries to put atheist brains in a sort of Schrodinger's box. Quoting from the article, "Constructing the illusion that there is no God takes a tremendous amount of hard work. It's not easy to convince yourself that you hold a belief that, in the core of your being, you actually don't. In other words, we believe that we believe in the non-existence of God, but we don't believe in the non-existence of God?" Such a statement, taken as a candidate belief proposition, strikes me as incoherent, in the same way that a Moore's paradox is incoherent. By the way, Morgan here is treating all atheism as the positive claim that God does not exist, instead of its proper definition of the absence of belief in God, but for right now we can ignore that distinction. For the sake of this discussion, we can define an atheist as one who has conducted a thorough and culpable examination of their mental states and found that they have a belief in the non-existence of God. Again, that's just for the sake of this discussion. But according to Jim Morgan, no such person exists. So on what basis does Morgan believe that deep in the core of our beings, we atheists, or rather we professed atheists, actually do believe in God? Quoting again, "The empirical and experiential evidence for God is too overwhelming in the complexity and synchronicity of creation, the birth of a baby, the heat from the sun, feelings of love, multi-layered immune systems, and our very existence." What I understand him to say is, the empirical evidence for God's existence is not only highly convincing, but compelling, in the literal sense of the word. And I don't just mean compelling to rational people, as that would entail the much weaker proposition that there are no rational atheists, but compelling to all people, rational or not. Thus, belief in God is not voluntary. Anyone who is ever exposed to the phenomena he lists cannot help but be a Christian theist. The proposed lines of evidence he lists, apparent design, beauty, love, and so on, which are very familiar to most active atheists, are so convincing to him that he cannot imagine anyone not being convinced. And that is at the heart of his claim, a failure of imagination. That's what we're talking about here. Morgan continues, quote, "More importantly, just as almost everyone knows who their parents are, deep down we all know who our Heavenly Father is. Our Father instilled in us a spiritual and moral compass that points directly back to Himself. The innate, undeniable connection we have with a parent persists even more strongly with the Lord." Morgan believes, because his religion teaches, that every person on earth has one of these compasses, and this compass unerringly leads to, or perhaps is, belief in God. And this, I believe, is a key point of Morgan's theism. It is an essential, inescapable part of what it means for God to even exist. This will come into play a little later. For now, I'm going to give you two ways to respond to this or any other "there's no such thing as an atheist" argument. The first is what I like to call the mirror image response. I believe, as Morgan evidently does, that beliefs are not voluntary, that one either believes or does not believe, is convinced or is not convinced. I cannot by any act of will stop believing that London is the capital of the United Kingdom. I would have to be given overwhelming evidence to that effect, and then be involuntarily convinced by that evidence. This is why I think that the first mirror image response is especially compelling. But I do want to emphasize that it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, something meant only to be employed as a response to this particular argument. It goes like this. Basically, there exists a great deal of empirical evidence for the non-existence of God in the world, so much and so widely known that I need not bother enumerating them here. How, the response goes, could any person observe all this stuff and not believe that an all-powerful, all-good God does not exist? It's impossible. The evidence for atheism is not only convincing, but compelling. Moreover, just as Morgan insists that every atheist has a spiritual and moral compass in their soul leading to God, I could easily ask, does not Morgan feel a void where such a compass ought to exist? I certainly feel the void, and since that void can only be filled by a God, my belief that God does not exist means that everyone feels the void. So is it not true that Morgan does feel the void and is doing a great deal of hard work to convince everyone, including himself, that he does not feel it, but feels a compass instead? In short, every professed theist is lying. Every professed theist believes in the core of their being that God does not exist. This mirror image proposition makes, in my opinion, at least as much sense as the other proposition, and I would argue quite a bit more. We have natural explanations for everything that Morgan has listed. The reason I do not make this claim outside the context of responding to the "there are no atheists" claim is that I am neither brave enough nor foolish enough to insist that such a great portion of the world's population are all lying about the same thing. Mistaken, certainly, but not lying. People would accuse me of being out of touch with reality to the extent that I am not worth having a serious discussion with. People would be right. The point here is that this ludicrous proposition that there are no theists is at least as sensical and even more so than the absurd proposition that there are no atheists. The second possible response to the "there are no atheists" argument is an absolute defeater, not merely of the argument, but of theism itself. It's the equivalent of your opponent pulling a knife and accidentally cutting their own throat. But it depends on Morgan's answer to the following question. Is the non-existence of atheists an essential part of God's existence, or is it merely happenstance that there are no atheists? Put another way, are the existences of God and atheists compatible or incompatible? If they are incompatible, which I believe Morgan believes to be the case, then atheism is firmly and irrefutably established. The defeater is a simple syllogism. Premise 1. If God exists, then no atheists exist. Premise 2. At least one atheist exists, namely myself. Conclusion. God does not exist. Morgan obviously does not believe premise 2, since he is not an atheist and is not willing to, take our word for it. But for those of us who are atheists, it is not only rational to believe premise 2, it would be irrational not to believe premise 2. And since premise 1 is true by stipulation, this argument is both sound and irrefutable. It is completely compelling. It cannot be defeated by any logic or reason other than by removing the stipulation or converting. And as for Morgan not accepting premise 2, well, we might facetiously reply that Morgan can know the premise as well. All he has to do is become an atheist. Again, that's a facetious reply. A more serious response is, we're not trying to convince him. It's enough that we ourselves are convinced. Since the atheist is in possession of an irrefutable argument, of an undefeatable argument against the existence of God, in the end, there is no point in discussing anything with someone who says there are no atheists. On the other hand, if Morgan says that the existence of atheists is a matter of happenstance, that it is not a necessary part of God's existence, then the defeater does not necessarily apply. Instead, I would reply that although I know Morgan to be wrong about the non-existence of atheists, being an atheist myself, I regard it as a side topic, a distraction from the actual point of the discussion and the only thing that I am interested in, the question of whether God actually exists. Then we can talk about the complexity of the universe, the birth of a child, and the other lines of evidence, assuming he is willing to, of course. However, I don't think that is the case. Think back to the spiritual and moral compass that Morgan spoke of. I think it is an essential, indispensable part of his theism. I think that without that compass in each of us, Morgan's God would not exist. So I do think that with respect to the God that Morgan believes in, our atheism is, to use a term from William Lane Craig, self-authenticating. It is its own proof. It needs no validation other than itself. So Morgan's attempt to convince atheists is really over before it begins. This is not to say that no God exists, necessarily, only that Morgan's God does not exist. The existence of a God whose existence is compatible with the existence of atheists is still an open question as far as we're concerned today, which means the atheist-theist discussion can continue. But it will have to continue without Jim Morgan or anyone else who believes that there's no such thing as an atheist. If you like this video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos like this, please hit the subscribe button. Both liking and subscribing help this channel a great deal, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching today. I'm David John Wellman, and the rest is up to you.